Today we're going to talk about using Watercolor Resists. This is using various tools, materials that will allow you to keep the paper white even if you paint over it with watercolor. These are important because watercolor doesn't actually have white as an option. We typically as artists use the paper tone to be white. So the idea was if you wanted something white as a highlight, you just don't paint there. But that can be difficult and tricky, especially if you're doing some sort of wash, like a gradiated wash, or just the wet and wet, you tend to get a little sloppy and crazy. There are some materials out there that will allow you to paint freely and still get that paper white. So what I've done is I've divided my page up into some different squares, and I'm going to show you the different materials in the squares and what they do. All right. The first material I'm going to show you is called Frisket. All right, the various companies make this. It is essentially liquid latex. And the idea is you can paint it on freely, and when it dries, it becomes like rubber or plastic. And that will resist the watercolor. It just won't stick to it, and it'll protect the paper. Now, I will warn you that the Frisket itself smells like dead fish. So do not sit there and attempt to smell it. The other thing is, since it is latex, it'll dry quickly and it will ruin your brush. You'll get a bunch of rubber stuck in there. So the idea is you use it quickly and clean your brush immediately. All right. So it comes, typically it's in a lighter color. I've seen whites, I've seen oranges and the like. And it is a thick liquid, and you just, wherever you want white to be on the paper, you paint the Frisket. Now, it doesn't have to be super thick. In fact, if you make it really thick, it will take longer to dry. What it just needs to be is on the page with good coverage. Now you can apply this. You're going to see I'm using a dry brush. It's going to give me some rougher strokes. If you do have a wet brush, it'll go on smoother, but it'll also go on thinner, so you have to be careful. It is a water-soluble product. Clean up a little water, a little soap. I generally don't like to thin it out more than I have to. And again, we're just painting this on. And we're going to let it dry. The second tool I'm going to show you is a little bit more old school. And it is called rubber cement. You might have used this before as a paste or glue. It was very common back in the old days. It's less common because it also smells really bad and it's very fumy and you don't want to hang out with it too long. It typically comes with a brush attached to the lid, which you can totally use, but it's a fairly thick brush with not a lot of nuance. But again, this is essentially rubber that's in a glue form. You can use it to glue things together. We're going to do the same thing we did with the Frisket. It's not as nice in terms of how it will spread and protect, but it does make for some interesting effects. So again, wherever you want the paper to stay white, you just paint on the image and you're going to let this rubber cement dry. And again, especially if you're using your nice brushes, as soon as you're done applying it, clean it out. All right. The final tool we're going to look at is simple old crayons. Now what's nice about a crayon, they are pigment, they're wax based, and that wax is going to be resistant to water. Again, it's going to make the watercolor so it won't want to stick to the page. Typically when I'm doing this, again, I stick to lighter crayon colors because I have a lot of colors in my watercolor that I can use. So usually that's a white. And you just want to color it on. If you're using the white, I know it's a little hard to see white on white paper. You want to color it on kind of thick. The other nice thing about the crayon, don't have to let it dry like the others. And just for the hay of it, I'm going to throw in a little yellow. It's much brighter, obviously. It'll do the same thing as the white, but it's going to give you a different texture than maybe the watercolor might get you, while also still resisting. Alright, so at this point, I just got to let my materials dry, and then we can start painting. Now that the Frisket and the rubber cement have dried, we can just go ahead and start painting right over the top of it, and we won't have to worry at all about the paper taking on that color. So again, I'm going to get my brush nice and wet, and I'm going to get it full of color. I'm going to just go ahead and dry brush. And what you should be able to see is that the paint's going on, but we're getting a slightly different tone where the watercolor is hitting it. It's not green like the paper, it's kind of a ghostly yellow. This is the Frisket. Try and get it really dark so you can see the difference. Almost like a ghost hitting there. And it doesn't matter. Once the Frisket is dry, it doesn't matter how wet you get your paper or your painting, because the Frisket is latex, so it's water soluble until it dries. And then once it dries, it's like rubber boots. No water's getting through that. Alright, so that's how the Frisket is looking. Let's go ahead and we're going to attack the rubber cement now. And again, you can see that this is even pooling up. The watercolor hits that rubber cement and it pulls away from it. It does not want to stick in the slightest. Just kind of mixing it up, showing that you can paint over the top of it any way you want. You can mix your colors. You can do all that wet on wet technique. Various concepts. Now let's go to the crayon. And again, you can see with the crayon that the watercolor does not want to stick. If I had gone even thicker with a crayon, it'd be much more dramatic. But I'm going to add more water to the watercolor so that it will do that. And let's come back in with a darker color. Definitely for the crayon, the water is going to help to sell that because, again, it's waxed. It wants to resist. So when you're painting on there, it's fighting, it's holding off, it's trying to keep that white. The thicker the crayon is, the better it'll work. Although, do want to be careful with the crayon. You don't go too heavy with the watercolor. It will eventually get there, but you can see that. All right. Now you're probably asking yourself, do I just leave those on there? For the crayon, we're done. That's how it's going to look. But we need to let the watercolor dry. We are actually going to come back and remove the rubber cement and the Frisket. So let's let things dry. Check in again in just a little bit. To remove our Frisket or our rubber cement, it really just needs to be rubbed off. Now there's two methods to do this. Some people like to just use their finger. Okay, the friction though, if you do it too rough, can start to hurt. Otherwise you can use an eraser. And the idea is you just come in, and since it's latex, it wants to stick together, but it doesn't want to stick to the page too much. You just rub it right off, and you reveal the white of the page again. This is great for keeping those highlights, those super important spots, because again, you don't have white paint as an option, and it can be difficult to avoid painting certain sections. This will allow you to block out the page. You can see that the rubber cement, not quite as good. It's a little harder to apply. So it's going to give me a slightly scruffed texture, which maybe you like. Maybe you prefer that to the cleaner Frisket layer. But both of them bring back our highlights. This is great for, you can paint a section out and then do your whole wet on wet gradation, pull that color down, get a great tone, and then bring your whites back out. All right, happy painting.